Hey guys, welcome back to the After Hours. I'm the A-Tail Beast, and today we're gonna wrap up what happened in Congress with the bank stocks. Recent failure of SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, sparked a debate inside of Congress, along with its acquisition after the failure. Now, what happened in Congress is you had a testimony from the Federal Reserve, and they pretty much tossed the blame around. There was a hearing in the Congress. The Federal Reserve had to give a testimony. The one to give the testimony was Michael S. Barr, the Vice Chair of the Supervision for the Federal Reserve. In his testimony, he said that not all of the blame for the failure for SVB should be on just the bank or just the Federal Reserve. It's somewhere in between. They played hot potato with whose fault is it? And I'll give you the end result. It's everybody's fault. Bottom line is, what came out of Congress that day was additional support to the banking system. The government responded by giving new programs that help provide ample amounts of liquidity for the banking system. It also addressed different measures on how to prevent a contagion, as well as ways to address failures in the financial institutions. Now, with SVB in particular, it had a unique nature. It had a concentrated business model. The business model focused on technology startups and the capital venture sector. Now, with this, it had a really likely chance to perform high growth. The people that manage SVB, they did not prepare properly, is what the vice chair said. But in Congress, they said it's the Federal Reserve's responsibility to be in charge of all banks. Now, at the end of the day, after a lot of cussing and discussing, it was said that the Federal Reserve was a step behind social media influencers. And the reason that happened was with SVB, at the end of its fiscal year, it had $170 billion in deposits. Up to March, about 90 or 80 billion of those were already out of the door. But the last thing that put the nail in the coffin was their announcement that $1.8 billion in sales was just realized. And they're planning to do a fundraising campaign the next week. In the effort to reassure its investors, it ended up having an opposite effect, and it sparked fears of insolvency. YouTubers and other influencers, they did their research and they saw there was an actual chance of insolvency. And with over 85% of the depositors uninsured, on top of just losing about 2/5 of their overall deposits, it didn't look good for them. According to Investopedia, a bank failure only takes half of its uninsured deposits to withdraw to cause a bank failure. And that's without any assistance. Now, at the end of the day, SVB, it was at fault because its management was very late to try to fix the problem. And then that gave the opposite impression of what happened to their performance. But on the other side, there's also the Fed, who was being managed by the Congress. So the Congress looked at the Fed and said, why didn't you do anything? You should have spotted this before people on social media. Well, the response to that was SVB was stuck in a transition period. Now, during these transition periods, the Federal Reserve looks at asset size thresholds. There's large banks, there's regional banks, and then there's commercial banks. When SVB failed, all regional banks and commercial banks felt the pressure. It goes down in the chain. While in the Federal Reserve, each asset size has to report to a different agency. The larger banks have to report directly to the Federal Reserve. The regional banks have to report to the FDIC, and each one have to give a resolution plan. And the Federal Reserve just got the notification that during the pandemic, which is 3 years, SVB tripled in its asset size. It was right on the $100 billion threshold. It was in a transition period. During this transition period, you had to wait until 2024 until SVB had to report directly to the Fed. This was unfair. It left several years for the bank to prepare for its first resolution plan to the Federal Reserve. So when it came to SVB, there was a lot of noise. The main reason we had a problem with SVB was because the people that supervise the banks, they all come from the Federal Reserve. They all come from the Treasury, but they're all in their own different sections and smaller programs to assist with very specific things. With SVB, it was in the middle. It was a regional bank. Now, SVB was riding this threshold for a while, but during the pandemic, it experienced rapid growth because it had a unique business model. Now, with this business model, it tripled in asset size during the pandemic. It crossed that $100 billion threshold. And because of that, they had to report to the Federal Reserve. Their first stress test was not scheduled until 2024. That gave them several years to prepare for their first stress test. But it was brought up in Congress that you can't use that as an excuse when they looked at vice chair. On top of that, they had created a smaller program, the BTFP, which is a program that will loan banks money up to a year in case there's a surprise demand. And the reason they created this program was because later in the Congress meeting, they figured out that out of the $40 billion that came out during March 9th, it wasn't just people from social media being scared about a bank run. It was actually 10 billionaires that took out $13 billion all at once. That's $130 million per person. When we used $20 billion of the deposit to bail them out, that was actually bailing out 10 billionaires. But what they told people in that 2 weeks of uncertainty was the people in SVB, and why they needed to freeze everything was because farmers and smaller companies, they needed to make payroll. And so that's why we had to use tax money. And that's why we had to start QE and stealth QE. Now, at the end of the day, the banking system on the broader scale, it was improved, but a lot of this stuff was just swept under the rug. So they made everything public when they were playing the blame game. Who do we blame? The management at SVB, the supervision from the Federal Reserve, or Congress that helped make the rules? Well, there was a former chair of FDIC, Sheila Barr. She came out and said there was so much unease going around. And with this unease, we knew that people were worried about what happened that led up to the failure of SVB. What happened after they labeled it a systemic risk? And why was the takeover of SVB rushed? She said, according to the normal rules from the Dodd-Frank and the technical laws, everything should have been fine. There was enough liquidity for payroll for everybody through their advanced dividends that would have came through the normal rules. And she even gave a shout out for the testimony from the vice chair for his transparency, because this was a unique situation. The vice chair of the supervision of the Federal Reserve, he said that this is the most and the fastest he's ever seen a bank run this fast. And they thought that this had something to do with the digital dollar and having access to money to where you can put it in and take it out really fast or at a click of a button, which led to conspiracy theories about maybe the Congress is going to try to manage the digital dollar. There's a lot of conspiracy theories going around. Was there internal traps set for SVB? Was this actually all because of their concentrated business model? Maybe systemic risks actually did fall inside of the banking system, and we saw what Contagion did to the broader markets. But we don't know how far the rabbit hole actually goes. If we did a digital dollar, would this actually fix anything? If we had stricter policies, if the stress test actually went to SVB, would that actually fix anything? The Federal Reserve is reviewing all of these scenarios, and they're seeing if they could have done anything to prevent this from happening. But at the end of the day, it happened, and it gave us more awareness on what can happen in the future, so we don't have more stuff happen like 2008. Now we have an even more secure system. It's all gonna be okay. All right, guys, that's all I got for you today. If you like what you saw, hit the like and subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.